Okay, so thanks to Aaron for this idea. Shot Aaron. But I'm going to be launching a lecture series where we talk about various topics within running and training science. And I'm going to try and put out one video a week, and we're going to do that hopefully for the whole year. So if you find these interesting or you like them, please engage with them. Please let me know. And then also, if there are any topics that you would love covered, likewise, leave a comment below the video or just WhatsApp me if you have my number. If you're watching this and you don't know me, do not WhatsApp me. But yeah, so I thought I would kick off this lecture series by talking about something which is quite topical at the moment, and that is the concept of VO2 max. I think it's very misunderstood. You may have seen some debates online, but in particular with regards to the outcome of UTMB last year, where Tom Evans and Ruth Croft both won UTMB. They're coached by a guy called Scott Johnston. And basically, Scott Johnston is not a huge fan of VO2 max at all as a training tool, or at least in the context of those two athletes. But I think it's fair to say that generally he's not a huge fan of VO2 max based training. But it is still one of these enduring concepts in endurance sports. And so I thought what I would do just for lecture one is a little bit of a deeper dive into what VO2 max is, how it is measured, why it is a useful metric, why it is not the be-all and end-all for performance. The story goes like this: the higher my VO2 max, the faster I'll run my next race. Sounds very logical, but it is rarely the deciding factor. I think part of the popularity of VO2 max is just the fact that it's so easy to measure and it is very intuitive to understand. You know, number go up, me feel better is pretty much the simple case version of it. And we all have these frickin' devices now, these guys, which tell us an estimate of our VO2 max. And then that estimate depends, or not depends, that estimate decides whether you feel like you're getting fitter or not. But we're going a little bit off topic. So what is VO2 max? First of all, VO2 max is in the name, but it is a measure of the maximal volume of oxygen that your body can utilize. It is usually standardized. So the number that you get on your watch is an estimate of the volume in milliliters that your body can utilize to produce energy every minute divided by your weight in kilograms. So it's measured in milliliters per minute per kilogram. How is it measured? Generally, VO2 max, the gold standard for measuring VO2 max is through a gas exchange test. You may have seen these videos where athletes put on a mask and then they run on a treadmill until they can't run anymore. It's called, volitional termination, but basically until you've reached your max effort. What the gas exchange does is it measures the volume of air coming into your lungs. So as you breathe in through the mask, they have a flow meter, measures the volume of air. Obviously, we know in air, 20.9% of air is oxygen. So we know the volume of oxygen that is coming in. And as you breathe out, again, they have a flow meter. So they know the volume of air that's coming out, which is pretty much the same as what's going in, but the ratio of gases will have now changed. So there'll be less oxygen in the air that is going out, and there'll be more CO2 and perhaps a little bit more water vapor as well. And so from the difference between the two measurements, they can get an idea, well, not an idea, they know how much oxygen your body has essentially utilized, how much oxygen you have consumed to produce energy. And so as you do that test, every minute you're breathing in and out, they will record, okay, what is the volume of oxygen that you're using every minute? And then they divide that by your weight, and then that is your VO2 max score. Um, what was I going to say next? Something smart, pretty sure. I don't have any notes, so I just have bullet points. Okay, so the test is essentially a measure then of the maximum amount of oxygen that you consume. If the test is done correctly, that value will plateau. So you will reach a true maximum. The graph will no longer be going up. You'll have now a flat line of your O2 intake. The camera's moving, following me around, sorry. And despite the fact that your pace is increasing or your effort is increasing. So then we know we've really reached the maximum value of oxygen intake. This was first recorded, I think, by a sports scientist called Hill sometime in the 1920s. And since then has become a very attractive metric in endurance sport. What is the value of the amount of oxygen that you can take in, or the maximum amount of oxygen that you can take in? Why do we even care about that number? Well, this has to do with the way our body produces energy. So there are more than two, but there are two major pathways that we use to produce energy to power exercise. We can call them the aerobic pathway and the anaerobic pathway. More generally, there are more specific terms. But essentially, in the aerobic pathway, you produce energy in the presence of oxygen from substrates. The substrates are either stored fats or stored glycogen reserves, which come from carbohydrates, or glycogen in the blood, which is blood glucose and stuff like that. So we can produce energy aerobically using those substrates, or we can produce energy anaerobically, so not in the presence of oxygen. And that pathway relies entirely on carbohydrate-based substrates, so sugars, glucose, glycogen stores, etc., which are broken down to glucose and then converted. So the energy that we produce via the aerobic pathway in the presence of oxygen is much more efficient than energy that is produced via the anaerobic pathway. It also doesn't have problematic waste products. So the waste products of aerobic energy production with oxygen are only water and carbon dioxide. And our body is very capable of handling those waste products. They are generally not a problem. We can get rid of them easily. We can deal with them easily. The problem is this. The amount of energy that we produce from the aerobic pathway is not sufficient to power higher intensity exercises. We need inputs from the anaerobic pathway. So as a result, we start having energy production increasing as effort increases, increasing. This freaking camera is still following me around, dude. It's because of my hand. So as effort increases, energy demand increases, and we have greater contribution from this anaerobic pathway. The waste products of the anaerobic pathway are something you may have heard of. That was a very Afrikaans grammatical construction. Sorry to my Afrikaans brothers and sisters for calling you out there. But the waste products of the anaerobic pathway, the primary one that is an issue is lactate. Which you may have heard of. Lactate is much harder for our body to deal with. And if we can't deal with it, you have a breakdown in the muscle cell. And that increases basically the concentration of hydrogen ions, and that is that burning sensation that we all know. And essentially it becomes rate limiting. If we can't deal with the waste products fast enough, we can't keep producing energy at that rate, and we have to reduce our effort. But we are getting very off topic. We're talking about VO2 max. But essentially, the higher your VO2 max is, the more oxygen you can utilize to produce energy, the better, because the more oxygen you can produce from a very efficient energy production pathway, which has minimal waste products. From an endurance perspective, that is a big thing, because it means that you'll be able to power your run, your cycle, your swim, whatever it is, efficiently for longer and at a higher intensity more efficiently. So VO2 max is certainly an important metric and something that we should care about. Here is where a bit of the nuance starts to come in, right? Your VO2 max score is a maximal measure of the amount of O2 that you can utilize. Most racing that we are engaged in is at an intensity well below VO2 max, right? So if you're doing ultra racing, marathon running, half marathon running, 10K running, 5K running, all of that is done sub-maximal, basically, in terms from an energy production perspective. Okay, so we've understood why we should care about VO2 max. Can you improve your VO2 max? Generally, yes. You can improve the amount of oxygen that your body can uptake and utilize. Those improvements are driven mostly by structural changes to your heart. You need to be able to increase the amount of blood that your heart can pump, the amount of blood carrying oxygen that your heart can deliver to the muscles. That is the sort of limiting factor in improving your VO2 max. So the way that it's generally accepted that you would improve VO2 max is by performing high intensity intervals. A very common method is, perhaps you've heard of, is the Norwegian 4x4. Basically, you'd perform 4-5 sets of 4 minutes hard, 4 minutes easy, equal rest, basically. And that 4 minute period is near maximal effort. But generally, equal intervals around that sort of time frame is how you would improve your VO2 max. The kicker is this: because improvements in VO2 max are driven mostly by structural changes to your heart, there's an upper limit in terms of what you can induce with your training. And that upper limit is generally genetically determined. The reason for that is your heart sits within quite a stiff sac of fascia called the pericardium. And that sac essentially constricts the size to which your heart can grow. So once you have trained your VO2 max pretty close to its capacity or its limit, you can't really train it to make it any bigger. So in terms of a pathway to improving performance, it is quite limited, because once you're highly trained, you're probably pretty close to the genetic limit of what your VO2 max is. But, and this is the interesting part, you can max out your VO2 max and yet, over the next decade, still improve significantly as an endurance athlete. There are many examples of this. Paula Radcliffe is one that is quoted quite often. She is a British marathoner, I think was the British Marathon world record holder at one point. I don't know if it was a world record or a national record, but her testing data is available, and you can see that over her career, her VO2 max dropped, but her marathon times continued to improve. Now, why doesn't VO2 max predict performance? And actually, if you look at well-trained populations of athletes, and I'll try and find the study and pop it up on the screen. But if you look at well-trained populations of athletes, you find that VO2 max is actually a very poor predictor of performance. Once you have a high enough VO2 max to be in the picture, your VO2 max score is largely irrelevant in terms of predicting performance outcomes or predicting who's going to be the best in a race. And the reason for that is that almost all endurance racing, or in fact all endurance racing, is submaximal. No one is racing anywhere near to the upper limit of of oxygen consumption demands. You're just nowhere close. So that number is not super important. What's much more important is what is happening below submaximal efforts. And things that are important for predicting performance here are fractional utilization of VO2 max. So what that means is how fast can you run at lactate threshold? How durable are you? How efficient are you at converting energy into movement? So that's something like running economy or movement economy. For road runners, this is things like tendon stiffness, biomechanics of your stride, ground contact time, stuff like that. On trail, because the nature of the terrain is so varied, those things, and the terrain is generally softer than the road, things like tendon stiffness are not as important. But on trail, technique starts to play a massive role. Like how efficient are you over technical terrain? Because if you're inefficient over that terrain, it's going to cost you a lot more energy to run at the same speed as someone else, regardless of what your VO2 max is. Durability is a large factor. How resistant are you to fatigue? How long can your muscle fibers continue to produce contractions for without basically conking out? So that's also another really important factor. And I will do another lecture on basically the key variables when it comes to predicting performance, of which VO2 max is certainly one. But it is not the be-all and end-all. And I think if there's anything that you take away from this first lecture is that VO2 max is more of a measure of your physiology. It is the ceiling in terms of that is the most energy you could produce from your aerobic pathway in a given setting. And it certainly helps to have a high ceiling, but most of your racing is happening well below your ceiling. So let's say you're someone who has a VO2 max score of 60 or 55 or 50 or whatever it is. And you see it go to 49 on your watch for whatever reason. Maybe you ran in the heat, maybe you ran in trail, and suddenly you start to spiral or panic and you think, oh my gosh, I'm getting less fit. What you need to understand is that you might be racing at 70% of the oxygen demand that your VO2 max can reach. And so it's much more important, how efficient are you at that level of oxygen demand? How well can you move at those speeds? How well can you shuttle lactate? How efficient are you over technical terrain? How good is your running economy if you run on the road? What is your tendon stiffness like? So I think there's a tendency to sort of really zoom in on this VO2 max number because, like I said, it's easy to measure. It's really easy to understand the number, even though we don't really know what that number means. And I hope this lecture has shed a bit of light on that. But it's really, really not the be-all and end-all of your training. And it's really not something that you should prioritize in improving. We would be much better served by improving how efficient you are at converting energy into movement. Be much better served by prioritizing the speed of your lactate threshold. So what fraction of VO2 max can you run up to before you start producing more lactate than you can clear? So that is basically the key takeaway is VO2 max is going to set the ceiling, but all races are decided far below that number. Cool. I hope you enjoyed this. If you didn't, don't let me know. And if you did, please do.